Welcome back to 28storms.com on this Thursday morning, the first day of September, and we have quite a lot of action to talk about, and primarily the upcoming Tropical Storm Lee that will be located in the central and northwest Gulf. And of course, we'll still keep a very close watch on Hurricane Katia, although we're not expecting that one to be a direct threat to any land within the next 5 days. So the central Gulf of Mexico is where we expect Tropical Storm Lee to form. And based on the latest tropical weather outlook, the Hurricane Center is giving that feature a 70% chance of forming within the next 48 hours. There's Hurricane Katia, and we have a new invest. It's called 94L invest in there in the northern Atlantic, but it's not going to be any threat, so we're not overly concerned about that system. Turning our attention closer to home, it looks like 93L invest to the south of Mobile, Alabama is continuing to show some signs of organization. We have a potential low-level surface circulation developing somewhere around here, and we will have the hurricane hunters flying out later this afternoon to determine if this system has already developed into a tropical depression. Now, we still have a very strong contrast here between a lot of convection just to the east of the wave axis, and then just to the west we really don't have much in the way of any convective activity, and that's because if we look at the latest water vapor image, we can still see that mid to upper level trough hanging tough from the Florida Panhandle westward to the upper Texas coast. Now, one thing that is interesting to note is that yesterday afternoon this upper level low was centered more toward the east, south of Mobile. And if that does continue to move more toward the west, then we could see a return of more favorable conditions across the central and eastern Gulf with a developing mid to upper level ridge that could help to ventilate this system a little bit better. The latest 850 millibar vorticity analysis from the SIMS website would also seem to suggest that any low-level surface circulation that forms today will do so between 89 and 90 degrees west longitude. Here is a quick look at the shear analysis. Once again, we still have quite a lot of westerly wind shear. However, we do have that upper level ridge located over the southwest Gulf and Bay of Campeche, and if that weak upper level disturbance were to continue moving more toward the west, then we could see these favorable upper level winds aloft begin to spread more toward the northeast into the central Gulf of Mexico. The model guidance for this system continue to vary widely, and the tracks range anywhere from Brownsville, Texas to the Florida Panhandle. But one thing that does look fairly certain is that this system will develop into Tropical Storm Lee and then begin to stall over the next 48 to 60 hours as the steering currents are expected to break down. So if this system were to eventually leave the Louisiana coast and head more toward the west, for example, we still fear that there could be some significant flooding over southern Louisiana as that system were to temporarily stall, and those outer bands could set up right along the coast if this system were to gain enough latitude initially. So that is a very strong concern this morning, and of course this could just be a problem that we have to deal with for the next week, as there are several models that show little to no movement. This is the 0Z Canadian CMC model forecast, and this model is showing what very well could be the best case scenario. The model does strengthen the storm into a strong tropical storm or minimal hurricane, but notice that it doesn't keep it in the Gulf quite as long as some of the other models do. In addition, it also takes it into southern Texas, and they desperately need the rainfall. And the model continues to show the system being pushed westward throughout the forecast period underneath mid to upper level ridging over the southwest United States. So we would deal with that because Texas needs the rain, and this model doesn't show quite as much of a slow moving system as some of the other models. However, there are more signs for concern, starting off with the 6Z GFS model. This is the 500 millibar steering pattern, and we will begin to see our tropical cyclone develop in the Gulf as we advance this into the first 24 hours. We see a developing vortmax here just to the south of New Orleans, and notice how close this is to the Louisiana coast. So the southern half of the state will definitely be dealing with some very high rainfall as early as within the next 24 to 36 hours. And notice how the system is not expected to move all that much. This is now by day 3, or overnight Saturday into Sunday morning. The storm is still hugging the Louisiana coast. This would bring extreme rainfall amounts for much of the central Gulf Coast states. And notice that as we go into day 3 and day 4, the model is beginning to show a shift more toward the south back into the Gulf. And that's because this trough that is now over the Appalachians is not expected to be strong enough to really pick up the system, and we have this ridge beginning to come back over Texas, and so therefore between days 4 and 6, that ridge is going to steer it more toward the southwest into lower Texas and upper Mexico. Now initially that may seem like a ridiculous track forecast, but there is some precedent for that occurring in the past. This was Hurricane Fern in September 1971. It struck southeast Louisiana as a tropical depression, but then it drifted back southwest into the northwest Gulf, and it developed into a hurricane and struck lower Texas. The same can almost be said for Tropical Storm Bertha in August of 2002. It struck southeast Louisiana as a tropical storm, and it attempted to redevelop in the northwest Gulf, but it really didn't do a good job of doing so, and it moved into lower Texas as a tropical depression. Now, keep in mind, though, that the more immediate concern, even if that southwest track were to occur, is that if this gets too close to the Louisiana coast, despite making a landfall or staying just offshore, is the threat of heavy rainfall associated with the system if it stalls very close to the coastline. And these are the GFS rainfall totals, and we can see that over the next several days the rainfall totals are only expected to increase. And as we go into the 5-day time range, notice that the GFS is forecasting in excess of about 5 to 15 inches of rainfall along the extreme lower coast here from central Louisiana as far east as Pensacola, Florida. Now notice that these extreme rainfall totals don't really extend inland all that much, but this is a definite concern for many interests here along the central Gulf. In addition, the NAM model is not very reliable in the tropics, but it does keep the tropical cyclone over Louisiana for a longer duration of time, and the 84-hour precipitation forecast is calling for in excess of 20 inches of rainfall just to the southeast of Louisiana, with several areas along the coast receiving in excess of 10 to 15 plus inches of rainfall. So again, I cannot stress enough the concern over the risk of flooding as long as this tropical cyclone gains that much latitude. And we are not the only ones seeing this. This is the latest 5-day precipitation forecast from the NOAA Hydro-Meteorological Prediction Center. They are forecasting in excess of about 17 to 19 inches of rainfall here along the coastal communities of southeast Louisiana. So this is going to be a major flooding concern. We are going to wrap up the model analysis with the 0Z European run, and if you compare yesterday's model runs with the runs from this morning, you will notice that the models are definitely flip-flopping back and forth. So keep that in mind, and all interests from lower Texas all the way eastward into southern Alabama and the Florida Panhandle are still advised to monitor this situation over the weekend. And as we advance the European into day 1 and day 2, we already see a well-defined tropical storm sitting just to the southeast of Houston, Galveston, and Lake Charles. And as we go into 72 hours, notice that the ridge that was once there is beginning to break down. We still have that trough coming out of the Midwest, and by 96 hours, notice that the trough is not expected to be overly strong initially, so therefore the ridge is broken down, the trough isn't strong enough, so therefore the storm is just left to sit here just to the south of the Louisiana coast. And if we had access to the European model's precipitation totals, I have a strong feeling that they would be just as high as some of the GFS and NAM model output. And as we go into day 5, the storm is still sitting in the northwest Gulf of Mexico while gaining some strength here. And by day 6 and day 7, the same can be said. This would be a rather extreme forecast with hardly no movement throughout the next 7 days. And as we go into day 8, we see that there is a reinforcing shot of troughiness over the Tennessee Valley, and perhaps that could finally be the thing that'll steer this storm in one particular direction. And today's run of the European is beginning to take this into the central Gulf Coast states. And I tell you what, if it were to sit down there that long and then still move directly over them within the 5 to 8 day range, then the flooding would just be enormous. Now, that could easily not verify. This could still go straight into Texas. Let's hope that the Canadian CMC run is correct. But again, there is a lot of cause for flooding concern here this morning, and we'll just have to keep a very close watch on the guidance as this system continues to evolve. So the main concern will be Tropical Storm Lee over the coming days, but we still haven't forgotten about Hurricane Katia. The system continues to show signs of organization. Once again, it should have no trouble becoming a major hurricane with time. And that is exactly what the latest Hurricane Center forecast is calling for, a major hurricane by 8 a.m. on Sunday, and this should continue to intensify further as we go into the early part of next week, and we still expect this to turn more toward the north at some point in the western Atlantic. Interests in Bermuda are still advised to keep a very close watch on this, but thankfully in terms of any east coast U.S. impacts, much of the model guidance is still indicating a very long wave trough over the western Atlantic over the next 10 days, so that should eventually turn this system more toward the north and eventually out to sea, but we will continue to monitor the storm's progress. So thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to check out 20gatestorms.com for more written discussions, along with our Facebook page for frequent updates throughout the day. And of course, Hurricane Tracker app. It's the #1 source of information when you're on the go. So thanks again, and have a good afternoon.